We kidnapped a girl for ransom. It ended terribly for Use. First half. It all started when I met Mitch. I was pretty small time before I met him in the state pen. We were cellmates. He was finishing up the tail end of a 5-year stretch for his part in an armed robbery and attempted murder, and I was just beginning a 2-year stint for getting busted for, well, let's just say I was an unlicensed pharmaceutical rep and leave it at that. I had been facing a much heavier sentence, but had cut a deal with the cops and turned in my partners, who were all small-time low-life punks themselves. Like I said, I was pretty small-time before I hooked up with Mitch, but Mitch was a seasoned pro who had some big connections on the outside. We were only cellmates for 18 months before he got sprung, but we hit it off together in that time. At night, we'd sit on our bunks after lights out, smoking cigarettes and passing an occasional joint, talking quietly, just shooting the shit, talking about our pasts. Truthfully, he became the closest thing to a best friend I ever had. I was lucky to have met someone like him. He was a pretty intense guy, kind of scary really, and had been a career criminal for most of his life. Like me, he'd had a fucked up childhood and parents who had pretty much ignored his existence until they'd needed a human stress ball to vent their frustrations upon. Unlike me, he was a pretty big guy, a broad-shouldered ex-bodybuilder with a hard, intimidating stare. I know I found him intimidating. He probably could have snapped me in two like a toothpick with one hand if he was so inclined. I was careful to never give him any reason to do so. He had some clout in the prison, and my association with him almost single-handedly saved me from being turned out by the other cons and becoming a plaything passed around in the shower room. Otherwise, I wouldn't have stood a chance on my own inside. I'm not a very big guy, and not intimidating at all. I finished my sentence 6 months later, and the first thing I did was give Mitch a call. I didn't really have anything else going for me. My family had washed their hands of me long before. I had no friends, and with a 10th grade education, and no real skills or training, the only line of work I was really qualified for was of the kind that entailed cleaning deep fryers, washing cars, or cleaning out gutters for minimum wage. Mitch picked me up outside the prison, driving a new Dodge Challenger that looked like he had just driven it off the dealership lot. He greeted me with a hug like an old friend, then drove me through the city to a warehouse near the docks. It was... He sat behind his polished oak desk in his office off the warehouse floor, bookended by a pair of huge goons in matching dark suits, smoking a huge cigar clutched in a hand decked out with what looked to be at least several $100,000 in expensive jeweled gold rings, eyeing me stonily as Mitch explained how he knew me and that I was looking for a job. And he finished. The Russian regarded me in silence for what felt like an eternity, but probably wasn't longer than 10 seconds, then shrugged and said in his heavily accented English, "Sure, why not?" And that was how I became involved in organized crime. I spent the next 5 years working for the Russian, gradually climbing up through the ranks of his organization, beginning as a low-level courier picking up envelopes from the Russians' team of distributors throughout the city that contained the proceeds of the product the Russian supplied them with, then delivering the envelopes to Mitch to give to the Russian himself. Sometimes Mitch accompanied me on these outings to make sure the distributors stayed in line and weren't skimming. Usually they played straight, but on a couple occasions Mitch had to get rough with a couple of them who he suspected were holding out. After about a year, the Russian felt he could trust me enough to promote me to the position of a middleman who picked up the packages containing his product from his suppliers and then delivered them to yet another buffer who in turn gave them to the distributors to sell. I usually went on these business trips alone, which always made me nervous because the Russian suppliers were pretty scary dudes themselves. But none of them ever gave me any trouble. I asked Mitch one time what the packages contained, what exactly the Russian's product was, and he replied in a deadpan tone of voice, "Girl Scout cookies," then gave me a hard, wordless look that told me that I shouldn't ask too many questions, and the less I knew, the better. I didn't push it. I had a pretty good idea anyway. It was pretty much the same racket I had been involved in before I got busted, just on a much bigger, better organized scale. Drugs were a big part of the Russian's business, but they weren't all he was involved in. He had a dozen different other rackets going on. The usual things: extortion, gambling, money laundering, prostitutes, stolen goods, dealing guns on the black market, match fixing, you name it. And of course, armed robbery. Eventually, I worked my way up into the circle of the Russian stock company of regular crooks. I wasn't a violent type by nature, and never really thought of myself as a career criminal before I met Mitch. Just a petty street dealer trying to get by. But in those 5 years I worked for the Russian, I discovered a lot of things about myself and found a side of my character that had been hidden from me up until then. I learned how to use a gun Mitch gave me, since it would have been difficult to obtain one legally, being a convicted felon, and ever though I, thankfully, never had to use it, I felt fairly confident I could if the need arose. I participated in 2 bank jobs and an armored car heist the Russian organized, all 3 successful, clean heists that left no one hurt and combined us over 4 million in cash. My share wasn't bad, even after the Russian had taken his sizable cut and the rest had been shared out 4 ways. The Russian considered himself something of a visionary, a businessman with a keen sense of strategy and acumen. He was always looking for ways to expand his enterprise, new schemes to bring in more cash. It was his idea to kidnap the girl. I was in my apartment one night, last fall, watching some piece of shit horror movie. A killer leprechaun was tearing a man's stomach open to retrieve the pot of gold he had magically transported inside of him when my phone rang. It was Mitch telling me the Russian wanted me down at his warehouse in 1 hour. I drove down to the docks and parked behind the warehouse where several other vehicles were parked. It was past 10 p.m. and this part of the city was deserted this time of night. I looked around in the darkness, shivering a little. It was late October and chilly, feeling a little uneasy, wondering why the Russian had summoned me so late and with so little notice. The rear service door beside the loading docks opened and a dark figure appeared, silhouetted against the light spilling out through the open doorway. I could see the smoldering red tip of a cigarette in its mouth. It was Mitch. Without a word, he gestured me inside. Kidnapping for ransom. It had been done before, with varying levels of success, and was still pretty common in the Russians' native country, although it didn't happen very often anymore here in the States. The Russian already had his target in mind, the 17-year-old daughter of a billionaire software mogul. She was something of a celebrity in her own right on account of her wild child reputation, and had been featured in several tabloids because of her numerous scrapes with the law for underage drinking drugs, and several DUIs and arrests for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Fed up with her unruly behavior, Daddy had finally intervened and sent his out-of-control daughter first to rehab, then to a girls' reform school where she had cleaned up her act and started behaving like a model citizen. She was now attending an exclusive East Coast boarding school and was bound for Harvard after she graduated next spring. The rugby that I had serious misgivings about this whole thing right from the get-go. I knew most ransom kidnappings never worked and usually ended with the perps either dead or in jail before they ever even saw the cash. And even if they did manage to collect the ransom, usually the bills had been marked or had their serial numbers recorded to lead back to the kidnappers. I voiced these concerns to the Russian, who assured me that he had already taken all that into consideration and planned to make sure the money would be untraceable. He explained to us that, given the size of the ransom, it wouldn't be feasible to demand it in cash. Instead, when we contacted the girl's father, he would be instructed to deposit the money into an encrypted, untraceable escrow account, which the Russian would then transfer into an again, untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. There would be no paper trail for the cops and feds to follow, no risky drop-off meeting. No one would ever see us or know who we were. At this point, Wyatt interrupted the Russian to ask exactly how big the ransom demand was. The Russian told us, $100 million, of which the four of us would each receive 10 million. You could have knocked us over with a feather. It was more than we had ever made knocking off banks, more than we could ever hope to make in a lifetime of working for the Russian, the kind of once-in-a-lifetime dream job most crooks can never hope to come their way. Driving her over 200 miles west to a small cabin in the woods, where we would be keeping her until her father paid up. Like I said, I didn't dig this setup from the word go. I'm a criminal, but this wasn't knocking over banks or transporting stolen goods or moving drugs. This was something else entirely, a whole new ball game. Kidnapping for ransom was serious shit and could get us all dead or facing some seriously heavy time, probably life without parole. After the Russian dismissed us from his office, I told Mitch about my misgivings, but he assured me that the Russian had planned everything with care and overlooked nothing. It would be easy as pie, and no one would get hurt. I should have said no and backed out, but I felt like I owed it to Mitch, and not just because he saved me from getting gang raped in Stir. Without him, the best I could have ever hoped for was working at Donald's and driving a 20-year-old car back to some shitty double wide I called home. And I confess, I also wanted that 10 mil. I let my greed get the best of me, take over and override my better judgment. I said, okay, and now they're all dead, and I have to live with it. The late night meeting at the Russian's office was a few days before Halloween. The three of us, me, Kenny, and Wyatt, spent the next 4 weeks meeting up with Mitch at his place to go over the plan and rehearse our parts. Mitch was a pretty methodical guy, and he liked to cover all the bases and leave no margin for error or any unexpected surprises. The girl's limo was scheduled to pick her and leave the school at 3 p.m. tomorrow, after the last day of classes before Thanksgiving break. There would be one guard in the back seat with the girl and one in the front passenger seat, estimating their mileage and allowing for any traffic holiday travelers that might slow them down, and assuming there were no pit stops on the way. Mitch calculated they would arrive at our location in roughly an hour. He would be parked at a rest stop a mile north of us, watching the highway, and would notify us by walkie-talkie when he spotted the limo, at which point we would intercept the limo. Kenny would be dressed as a road worker with signs blocking the road. Me and Wyatt would be hiding off on either side of the road. When the driver got out to ask us what was going on, we would go into action. Kenny would draw on the driver and make him get down on the ground before zip-tying his hands behind his back. Simultaneously, me and Wyatt would come up from behind the limo. Wyatt would open the rear door and pull his gun on the guard in the back seat with the girl. I would handle the one in the passenger seat. After we disarmed the guards, we would zip tie them as well, along with the girl. By then, Mitch would be on his way back. He'd pick us up, make the call to the girl's father, and we would be on our way to the cabin. And that was it. After we arrived at our destination, all we had to do was wait for the Russian to call Mitch and let him know the money had been transferred. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But you know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and men. Things didn't go as smoothly as we had planned. In fact, it was pretty much a total fucking disaster. I never did like or trust that bastard. Kenny was okay, even if he was a little flaky and tightly wound. The kind of guy who seems to be perpetually nervous and jumps at the slightest noise. He was still pretty young and green, but was a reliable guy all the same. Wyatt, on the other hand, I only worked with him once before, on the first bank heist I ever pulled for the Russian. It's a miracle that didn't turn into a bloodbath because of him. You ever see Reservoir Dogs? They're blonde. That was pretty much Wyatt, except Wyatt was even worse. He had these wild eyes that always had this crazy gleam in them, kind of like Charles Manson, and this leering, soulless smile that gave me the creeps. They reminded me of this fucked-in-the-head kid I knew in 5th grade who would go into a pet store, buy a goldfish in a plastic bag, then take it out around back and smash it against the wall as hard as he could. And if the fish survived the impact, he'd stand there watching as it flopped around on the ground until it died. He was a sociopath with a hair-trigger temper and poor impulse control. The type who could turn into a loose cannon at the slightest provocation. The kind of guy who'd shoot you just to watch you die. He was a killer just like Mitch, but unlike Mitch, who only killed people if it was business, Wyatt did it for fun. As a teen, he had been arrested for shooting a middle-aged couple to death in the convenience store they owned, and then attempting to rape their daughter in a holdup that had gone wrong. He probably would have gotten life except that his scumbag lawyer got him off on some bullshit technicality or other. The police also suspected him in 6 other killings. If they knew how many it really was, he confided in us once, they'd lock me up till the end of time. Then he smirked gloatingly, which made my blood run cold. It started off according to plan. Me, Kenny, and Wyatt were huddled behind a tree off to the side of the road. We were out in the country in the middle of nowhere, in a small wooded area in otherwise vast and open farmland. The nearest town was over 5 miles south of us. It was a chilly, overcast late fall day. Most of the trees were bare, a windy rainstorm the previous night having denuded them of their remaining autumn foliage. Wyatt was chain smoking the non-filtered Pall Malls he favored, being careful to deposit the butts in his jacket pocket instead of tossing them in the ground to avoid leaving evidence. And Kenny, who was something of a comic book superhero geek, was in the middle of telling us some long-winded spiel about how Superman was an allegory for Jesus Christ. Neither of us were paying much attention to him. I kept peering around from our cover to scan the highway which wound through the trees. We had been in position for over an hour, and several vehicles had passed, but none of them were our target. Besides, Mitch was at his spot, a mile up the road acting as the lookout, and he'd let us know when they were on the way. Wyatt finally got fed up with Kenny's Superman Christ comparison. Suddenly, the two-way radio clip to my belt crackled to life, causing us to jump. I answered it, and Mitch's filtered, slightly staticky voice said the words we had been waiting for. "They're coming." I felt a surge of adrenaline, nervous anticipation that this moment we had been waiting and planning for almost a month had finally arrived. I was also extremely scared. I exchanged looks with my two accomplices, our faces suddenly tense, and wordlessly we got ready. Kenny, wearing a road worker's hard hat and reflective yellow vest, which Mitch had supplied him with, kissed the silver St. Christopher's medal he wore around his neck, a gift from his now dead mother that he always wore before a job as a good luck charm, then picked up one of those sawhorses with the diagonal black and white stripes and flashing lights they used to block the road during construction, which Mitch had also supplied him with, and dragged it out from behind the tree, positioning it in the middle of the road, then went back for the orange rubber cones that went with it, placing one on either side. Then he just waited there. Though Sammy and Wyatt took black ski masks out of our jackets and pulled them over our heads. Then Wyatt checked the magazine of his Beretta 9mm, and I checked the magazine of my 1911, a 1.45. Then we nodded to each other, and he ran across the road, hiding in the brush on the other side, just opposite the tree. I checked my pistol to make sure the safety was off. I heard the limousine slow down and come to a stop on the other side of my hiding place and idle there. Then a door opened and the sound of feet walking across the asphalt. "What the fuck is this shit?" a man, the driver, I presumed, asked in a tone of exasperated annoyance to Kenny. Then I heard the sound of a gun, Kenny's .357 Magnum Smith Wesson, being cocked, and the driver, his stunningly more docile, all traces of annoyance gone, said hooah. "Easy there. Get down on the ground now," Kenny shouted, his voice slightly shaky, betraying his nervousness and apprehension. I took a deep breath. It was showtime. I stepped out from behind the tree and made a beeline for the passenger side door of the limo. Wyatt was already heading for the rear door, gun in hand. I yanked the passenger side door open at the same moment Wyatt did likewise to the rear door. A huge beefy man in a dark Armani suit, hand already reaching into his jacket for a shoulder holster, jerked his head towards me with a wide-eyed expression of surprise. I shoved the .45 in his face and shouted, "Put UP your hands." That was when everything turned to shit. I was going to instruct the guard to get out of the limo, disarm him, then have him lie down in the road and bind his hands behind him with the zip ties in my pocket. But it never got further than me demanding he put up his hands. 4 deafening gunshots erupted from the rear of the limo, followed by the shrill, high-pitched, horrified scream of a young woman. I jumped, startled, and jerked my head to look. On the other side of the limo, Wyatt was aiming his now smoking Beretta into the rear seat. I could see him grinning through the mouth hole of his ski mask. "Wyatt, what the fuck?" I shouted at him, stunned. I realized a second too late we weren't supposed to use our real names to address each other. I glanced in the back, but the glass divider that separated the front and back seats was tinted too dark for me to see what had happened. I had a good idea though, no choice. He pulled his piece on me. Wyatt screamed. Instinctively, I leaned in and whipped him savagely across the face with the barrel of my .45, the sight at the front of the barrel opening a gash in his cheek. He grunted in pain and went slack, hand falling away from his pistol. "Shit," I muttered, then reached in and yanked his Glock away and threw it into the woods. The three of us were wearing gloves to prevent leaving fingerprints. I aimed my gun back in the dazed bodyguard's bleeding face and was once again going to demand he get out and lie on the ground when there was another feminine scream from the back of the limo. I glanced over. Wyatt was leaning in and struggling to drag the girl out over the body of the rear seat bodyguard. He suddenly yelled in pain and recoiled, clutching his gloved right hand. "Bitch bit me," he screamed. The rear door opposite Wyatt flew open and the girl, wearing a private school uniform, leaped out and started sprinting down the highway in the direction the limo had come from. "Fucka," I shouted and chased after her, quickly overcoming her and tackling her to the ground. She squirmed and struggled beneath me. Behind me I heard 3 more gunshots ring out, followed by a cry of pain, then 1 more shot. Occupied with the kicking, thrashing girl beneath me, I didn't pay it much attention. "Give me a hand here," I yelled at Wyatt. I stood up, panting, and was shocked when Wyatt suddenly kicked the girl in the stomach twice with savage brutality, his face contorted with rage. "That's for biting my hand, you bitch," he snarled. "Hey, cut that out," I shouted at him just as he was cocking his foot back for a 3rd kick. I glanced back to see what that shooting had been about and saw the body of the 2nd bodyguard lying sprawled face down on the side of the road. Shot Wyatt a hard stare and he just shrugged nonchalantly. "He tried to run while you were dealing with her," he said, gesturing to the girl. Just then, we heard the sound of another approaching engine. Oh shit, Kenny wailed, alarm, tensing. I glanced down the road. Relax, it's just Mitch, I said, recognizing his Dodge Challenger. He drew closer and then slammed on his brakes, tires screeching to a halt, when he saw the corpse of the bodyguard lying beside the road. His door flew open and he leaped out of the car, appalled. What the fuck is this? He demanded, but there was no time for explanations, accusations, or recriminations. We had to get the fuck out of there fast before another motorist came along. Never mind. Get in the fucking car, all of you. Ken, help me with her. We'll put her in the trunk. Hey. What about him? Wyatt asked, pointing to the limo driver. Just leave him, Mitch replied. That sick, chilling smile crept over Wyatt's face and he shook his head. No witnesses. And with that, he drew his Beretta and strolled over to the driver. Hey, Mitch protested. What the fuck do you think you're... Jesus fucking Christ. Mitch screamed at the top of his lungs, outraged and more pissed than I had ever seen him before. You fucking psycho. Get in the fucking car. NOW. He looked to me. Where's her purse? Is it still in the limo? I found my voice and stammered. Yeah, I think so. Well, get it and be quick. I raced back to the limo and looked in the back seat. Her purse, some leather designer number, was lying on the floor. I reached in and grabbed it up, then turned to head to Mitch's car, but I paused briefly and glanced at the bullet-ridden body of the guard who was slumped to his side in the back seat. His jacket was hanging open and I saw his Glock was still in its shoulder holster, the strap still fastened over the butt. Fuck, I muttered, then ran over and hopped into the back of Mitch's Challenger with Kenny. Mitch got in the driver's seat and Wyatt got into the shotgun seat. Mitch peeled out of there, leaving the carnage behind. We drove in silence for about half an hour. Wyatt sat glancing idly out at the passing scenery, as cool as could be, casually smoking one of his unfiltered Pall Malls, blowing the smoke out the cracked open window. The rest of us were all pretty shaken up by what had happened. We all silently contemplated the botched abduction and the possible ramifications of it. No one was supposed to have gotten hurt. Now 3 people were dead, executed in cold blood, and we had a teenaged girl bound in the trunk. Mitch was tense with rage the entire time. his fingers clenching the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, his lips pressed tightly together, his jaw clenched. What the Wyatt didn't even flinch. He just kept puffing on his cigarette. Mitch continued, "Did you fucking develop amnesia between the last month and this morning? Did all the planning we did slip out through your ear while you were sleeping last night? You had orders. This was supposed to be a clean grab, and no one was supposed to get hurt." "I did us a favor," Wyatt replied in a bored, casual tone. "How the fuck do you figure that, asshole? Those guys were a loose end. They could have identified us. How so you were all wearing fucking gloves and masks?" Wyatt suddenly pointed a finger to the back seat in my direction, taking me by surprise. "This genius said my real name while we were grabbing the chick. It might have stuck with them when they went to the cops. Wyatt ain't a very common name, you know. Then they could have narrowed it down and traced it back to me through my record, and then they would have tracked us all down and we'd be fucked." Mitch shot me a frown from the driver's seat. "That true?" I fumbled for an excuse for a few seconds, then admitted with a sigh, "Yeah, I fucked up. Things got crazy and I wasn't thinking. I slipped. We were all supposed to use code names for the duration of the job. Mitch was number 1, Wyatt was number 2, I was 3, and Kenny was 4. I saw Mitch roll his eyes in the rearview mirror in disgust. He shook his head and muttered Jesus under his breath, then said aloud, "Fucking bunch of amateurs." Then what fucking... After that, we drove for another 10 minutes in silence. Our mood was somber. There was some logic in Wyatt's argument, but that didn't justify his cold-blooded murder of the 3 men in the limo. He had escalated things and taken them in an entirely new direction, a direction we hadn't wanted them to go. Our situation was more serious now. Kidnapping and extortion had been bad enough, But if they caught us now, we'd also be facing 3 counts of first-degree murder. Can you We have your daughter, Mitch said. I heard a muffled, inaudible voice begin to reply on the phone, but Mitch cut it off. Shut the fuck up and listen. You want to see her alive again? Follow these instructions exactly. I want 100 million US dollars transferred electronically into the following bank account. He gave the girl's father the long account number the Russian had given him to memorize. Once the money's been deposited, she goes free. You have 72 hours. If you don't pay, she's dead. Don't go to the police or the FBI. You are being watched. That last bit was total bullshit, of course. The guy wasn't being watched, and we didn't really expect him to not go to the authorities. It just seemed like standard ransom kidnapper etiquette, the kind of thing they always say in the movies. Mitch ended the call, then got out of the car, taking the girl's phone and purse across the cracked, weedy parking lot. He placed both on the ground, then smashed the phone into pieces with a big rock, and then, for good measure, doused both it and the purse with lighter fluid and set them on fire with his Zippo. Well, that's that, he said, getting back in the driver's seat. The hard part's over. Now we just gotta wait. We drove west, out of the country and into the suburbs, then through a city. On the outskirts of the city, Mitch turned onto the interstate, and gradually the gas stations, fast food joints and strip mall fell away, replaced one again with open country, barren and desolate on this gray, late fall afternoon. After about an hour, Mitch got off the interstate onto another highway, and open farmland gave way to increasing thick wilderness. The sun began to set and nightfall descended. Mitch switched on his headlights. We drove for about 20 minutes, then Mitch pulled onto an unpaved dirt road running directly through the woods. Our destination was a small cabin 5 miles from the nearest town, out in the middle of nowhere where no one would give us any trouble. Mitch had rented the place a week ago for a month, paying cash and using a fake name. He had gotten the place cheap because it had a pretty fucked up past a few years before. Some dumb kids had come up there to celebrate their school graduation. Only one of them had gone nuts and murdered his friends before disposing of the bodies and taking off. He had left some bizarre journal, or something explaining that some bloodthirsty monster had killed his friends and had him trapped in the cabin. None of the bodies had ever been found, and the killer was still at large. The road grew narrower and more overgrown the deeper into the woods we drove, the trees pressing in close and looming over Mitch's Challenger on either side. I started feeling a little creeped out, dwelling on Mitch's story of this place. Eventually, the cabin appeared in the distance, tiny at first, but getting bigger as we approached. Finally, Mitch stopped the car, shut off the engine, and we were there. "We're here," he said unnecessarily. None of us said anything. We just sat regarding the small, run-down cabin we would be staying at for the next few days. "This place looks fucking creepy," Wyatt muttered at last, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I agreed from the backseat. "I feel like any second Leatherface is gonna pop out wielding a chainsaw at us." "I dunno," Kenny disagreed. "This place looks more like the cabin from The Evil Dead." "Some fucked up shit did happen here a few years back," Mitch explained to Kenny, who hadn't heard about the place's past. "What kind of fucked up shit?" Kenny asked, intrigued. "Never mind that right now," Mitch said, opening his door. "Let's just get the girl inside and get settled in." We got out, putting our ski masks back on, and gathered around the trunk. Mitch opened it. The girl was curled up on her side, whimpering softly, the pillowcase still covering her head. Her skirt had hiked up some, revealing most of her legs up to her thighs. I glanced at Wyatt and caught him leering at this, and felt a flash of dismay. This freak wasn't just a killer, after all. He was a sex offender. I also caught him ogling her exposed legs and told him in a hard, threatening voice, "Don't even fucking think about it." Then he said to the girl, "We're taking you out of the trunk. Don't fucking kick or fight, or you'll be sorry." He turned to me. "Give me a hand." I helped Mitch lift the girl out of the trunk, and we carried her to the cabin. Mitch told me to set her down for a second, so he could fumble the keys out of his back pocket and unlock the door. Then we took her inside. It was There's a generator out back. Wait here a minute, I'll start it up, Mitch said, taking a pen light out of his jacket. The three of us, me, Kenny and Wyatt, stood there in the dark for a few minutes with the girl between us, her hands bound behind her with zip tees, a pillowcase covering her head. None of us said anything as we waited on Mitch. The only sound was the girl's uneven, frightened breathing. Finally, I heard the faint rumble of a motor outside and an overhead light bulb flickered, then came slowly to life, dim at first, then brightening. We looked around the cabin. It wasn't much to see. One large front room that was a combination living room kitchen with a narrow hallway in the rear that Mitch had told us led to a tiny bathroom and 2 bedrooms. Mitch re-entered and shut the door behind him. "Okay, bring her over to the kitchen," he said. We led the girl over and Mitch motioned for us to sit her down in a chair. He gestured us back, then scooted another chair across the floor until it was directly in front of her. He sat down to face her. "You're Katrina, right?" he said. "Yes, sir," she stammered fearfully. Mitch took a pack of Luckies out of his leather jacket and lit one with his Zippo. He took a drag, then looked thoughtfully at the cigarette. "You want to smoke, Katrina?" he offered. And no thank you, sir," she replied with cautious politeness. "Come on," he insisted slyly, "I know you smoke. And not just cigarettes." Wyatt snickered at this, and Mitch shot him a glare. "Not anymore." "I'm a decent person now. I've cleaned up my behavior," Katrina answered. He comes just don't do anyone. "Yes, sir," she said, nodding her head. "You can call me number 1. My associates are number 2, number 3, and number 4. You need something, like having to go to the bathroom, just ask one of us and we'll be happy to oblige." But his voice dropped, becoming low and slightly threatening. "Don't make a single fucking move without asking us first, you understand?" She nodded her head, frantically terrified. His tone softened. "Just sit there and keep quiet and I promise you'll be okay. Hopefully your dad will pay up sooner rather than later. Then me and my buddies will be a whole lot richer and you'll be a whole lot safer. In a month, we'll be chilling on an island somewhere and you'll be back home with Daddy. We'll all be happy and this will just be a bad memory." He stood up and turned to the 3 of us. "Okay, number 3, that was me, you come with me. We're going into town to get some supplies. Number 2 and 4, stay here and keep an eye on her. We'll be back in a couple hours." I followed Mitch outside and we got into his Challenger. He started the engine and off we went. Mitch and I didn't talk much on the ride into town. The radio was on and we listened intently. News of the killings and the abduction had already broke. The state police and the FBI had begun a manhunt and issued a nationwide Amber Alert. There was no mention of the kidnappers having contacted the girl's father and making a ransom demand. Not yet, anyway. "So far, authorities have no leads," the newscaster said in finishing. Mitch nodded, seemingly satisfied. I stopped at a small mom-pop grocery store and bought enough food to last us a few days, plus several cases of beer and a couple cartons of cigarettes. After we got back in the car, Mitch called the Russian and spoke to him briefly. There was no indication that the girl's father had started the money transfer, but it had only been a few hours, and Mitch wasn't discouraged. "Hey Mitch," I said as he ended the call, "are we really going to let her go if her old man pays?" Mitch was silent for a moment. "I gave her my promise, didn't I?" He replied without looking at me, which really wasn't the same thing as an answer. He lit another cigarette, then started the engine, and we headed back to the cabin. A cold, late fall moon was climbing the night sky. It was full and seemed unusually luminescent, casting an eerie, bluish lunar glow over the countryside as we drove. We made a bad mistake, a terrible mistake, leaving that nutjob Wyatt in the cabin with the girl while we were out. We should have known better. But the only excuse I can think of is we were both still pretty rattled by the brutality of the botched kidnapping and weren't thinking clearly. Maybe Mitch reasoned that Wyatt wouldn't dare try anything with Kenny there to keep him in line, but Kenny was too soft and Wyatt was a lunatic. We heard the screams coming from the cabin as we pulled to a stop outside, somewhat muffled by the glass of the car windows, but audible nonetheless. Mitch shut off the engine, and we both jumped out of the car. We could make them out more clearly now, a girl's screams and sounds of a struggle, then a furious voice, unmistakably Wyatt's, shouting, "You fucking little cunt," followed by the sound of a blow and a cry of pain. Mitch reached it first and slammed it open with his shoulder. I was a split second behind him. We both froze there for a second at the hideous spectacle that lay before us. Kenny was backed into the corner, trembling, an almost comical look of horror on his face, hands held up in the air. In the middle of the room, Wyatt was on the floor straddling the girl, his pants down around his ankles, his hands wrapped tightly around her throat, throttling her with all his strength. His face was red and twisted into an insane snarl of rage. The girl's face was turning purple. Her eyes were bulging out of their sockets, her tongue sticking out of her mouth. She was thrashing around beneath Wyatt, but even as we watched, her struggles were weakening. "Oh, Jesus Christ," Mitch said in a choked voice that was nearly a whisper. Then he darted forward, moving for Wyatt. "You fucker," he shouted. Wyatt released his grip on the girl and spun around, suddenly alarmed. He started to reach into his jacket for his pistol, but Mitch was on him in a flash, tackling him. He disarmed Wyatt, then ordered me to cover the maniac while he checked on the girl. I drew my .45 and kept it pointed at the psychopath on the floor. Mitch examined the motionless body of the girl. His head fell forward, his shoulders slumping. He groaned in dismay. "She dead?" I asked, never taking my eyes off Wyatt, who glared back at me, his teeth bared. "Yeah, I think so," Mitch said flatly. He stood up and turned slowly, deliberately, to where Wyatt cowering. Mitch's eyes were blazing with outrage, and he was quaking with fury. Wyatt, realizing what was about to happen, pointed his finger at Mitch and spoke defensively. "Hey, don't even fucking think about." "Phew, JM." Mitch smashed his fist into Wyatt's face, putting his full 250 pounds into the blow. Wyatt was knocked back, his head slamming into the floor so hard it made the boards rattle. Mitch leaped on him like a cat, beating him to a pulp in a wild, merciless frenzy, a mindless barrage of left and right blows. Wyatt began to scream, then he began to shriek, then he began to wail, then he began to sob like a 5-year-old girl who just dropped her ice cream cone on the sidewalk. Finally, the rain of blows slackened and stopped. Mitch, exhausted, got to his feet, panting. Wyatt writhed and moaned, his face an unrecognizable mess of blood and swollen flesh. Mitch drew his gun and pointed it down at Wyatt's head, shielding his face with his other hand against the impending splatter. His fingers started to tighten over the trigger, but at the last second he refrained from pulling it. He lowered the pistol and looked down with contempt at the sniveling, whimpering killer. "It's a bullet to the brain's too good for you," he seethed. "I'm going to leave you alive for the Russian. After he hears what you did, you're going to wish for a shot in the head." Mitch looked at me. "Tie this son of a bitch up." I looked in my pockets. turned to Kenny, who had been cowering against the wall the whole time. Glaring, Mitch took a menacing step in his direction, causing Kenny to start shuddering in terror. "What the fuck were you doing just standing there?" Mitch demanded. "Why didn't you try to stop him?" "I tried, Mitch, I swear I did." Kenny blubbered in a panic. "He went crazy after you guys left. I tried to stop him, but he pulled his gun and put it in my face. Said he'd kill me if I got in the way. There was nothing I could do." Kenny's knees buckled and he slid down the wall into a sitting position and began to weep. Mitch turned away from him in disgust. He looked at the dead girl. "I'm sorry, Katrina," he said softly, then crossed the room and sat down on a couch. He lowered his head into his hands and moaned. I turned away from Wyatt, now safely restrained, and looked down at the girl's body. She was almost naked, her torn clothing scattered around her, her body covered in bruises, her neck a hideous purple color. I could see the marks of Wyatt's fingers around her throat. The pillowcase had come off her head during the struggle, and for the first time I saw her face. She had long blonde hair and was very pretty, or had been anyway. Her dead eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling in sightless horror, her tongue still protruding from her mouth. I felt a wave of pity and disgust. "Not as much as you might think," he replied. I looked at him, confused, and was getting ready to ask him to elaborate, but just then his phone rang in his jacket pocket. He took it out and looked at it. "It's the Russian," he said, then answered it. "Yeah, it's me, Sergey. What's the word?" Mitch listened for about a minute and nodded. "That's good." He listened, then said in response to whatever the Russian had asked, "Well, things are pretty much a shitstorm here. It's kinda got out of hand, but I'm on top of it now. It went down pretty much as we had planned, just not exactly how we intended it to." He listened. "Yeah, the girl's gone." He listened. "Yeah, I know we weren't supposed to do it until after we knew for sure he was going to pay. You can thank that piece of shit Wyatt for that. I'll explain when we get back." He listened. "Yeah, Sergey, I will." Mitch ended the call. He looked at me and Kenny. "A little good news. Looks like the guy's gonna pay." I stared at Mitch, something dawning on me. "You were planning on killing her all along, weren't you? You never were going to let her go." Mitch said nothing. "Christ, Mitch." He shrugged. I lied. He gave me a look. "Jesus, what fucking fairy tale world are you living in? You seriously think we could just turn her loose when this was all said and done? Get real. This is serious business. We can't leave any witnesses. She didn't know our names, she never saw our faces." I protested, but she heard our voices. Sometimes that's enough. Couldn't take that chance. He sighed and rubbed his face. But it wasn't supposed to be like that. He looked over at her naked, violated corpse, hideously sprawled on the floor nearby. A one in the back of the head, quick and painless. She never would have even known. She was just a little stuck-up rich bitch. Wyatt screeched at Mitch. We were gonna waste her anyway. Why let it go to waste? Shut the fuck up, or I'll shut you the fuck up. Mitch bellowed at him. "So what do we do now?" Kenny asked. "We gotta get rid of the evidence. We'll bury her out in the woods. Then we'll burn this whole place down. Why not just leave her in here? She'll burn up with everything else," Kenny said. deep one. There's a work shed around the side. Should be a shovel or two in there. Yeah, Kenny and me looked at each other nervously. Sure, Mitch, I said. We left the cabin. But we found a small, remote clearing several 100 yards away from the cabin and took turns digging a 6-foot deep grave under the light of the full moon. It took almost 2 hours, and by the time we were finished, the moon was almost fully risen. It was nearly midnight. I didn't say much, too preoccupied with my own thoughts, but Kenny just kept crying and saying I wish I'd never gotten involved in this job while playing with his St. Christopher's medal. He was a total wreck. Finished, exhausted, and dirty, we headed back to the cabin. Mitch was sitting in a chair guarding Wyatt. Done? I told him. All right, good. Now bury her. We went to the girl's body and started to pick her up. We stopped. Mitch, I said. The girl's body was moving, twitching and shuddering spasmodically. What? He asked without looking at us. You might want to come see this, I said. He got up and come over. What the fuck? He said when he saw what was happening. She's still alive. Kenny exclaimed. Nah, it's just a death reflex, I argued. Rigor mortis setting in. Yeah, Mitch agreed. That's probably all it. The girl blinked her eyes. They turned to look at us. She opened her mouth and moaned. Jesus fuck, she's alive, Mitch said in disbelief. She sat up and began to get to her feet. We backed away from her slowly, too shocked by this phenomenon to know how to react. As we watched in dreamy, unbelieving horror, she began to change. Her skin began to ripple all over her body, as if things were moving underneath it. Her body began to contort. We could hear her muscles contracting. She opened her mouth wide and emitted a long, high-pitched shriek that started to change halfway through, becoming deeper and guttural until it didn't sound remotely human. The primal howl of an animal. Thick, coarse black hair began to burst through her skin. Her mouth and nose began to push out from the rest of her face, elongating, turning into a snout. Her teeth grew and became pointed. Her fingernails extended into 6-inch claws. Is this really happening? Kenny said in a near daze to no one in particular. Its transformation complete. The thing that had been a Dural just minutes before stood before us, in its full grotesque glory, no longer human. A hideous beast creature covered in black fur, a huge mouth full of needlepoint fangs, and hands that had become claws tipped with razor-sharp talons. It looked at us. Even its eyes were inhuman, yellow and luminous, the eyes of a wolf. We cowered before it, no more than 10 feet away. It stood between us and the door of the cabin. We were trapped. It took a step in our direction. Then it turned its attention to the man bound on the floor. Wyatt. Tom. He had also been privy to the girl's transformation and was struggling against his restraints, uselessly trying to free himself, terrified. Easy prey. The beast roared and pounced upon him. Wyatt's pants were still down around his ankles. It attacked him where he was most vulnerable, where his body was most exposed. Wyatt screamed hysterically in agony and terror. Help, Emmy. Oh, Jesus, get IT off, get IT off. Emmy, help, Emmy, help, Emmy, help. Get in the bathroom. Mitch shouted at me and Kenny while the monster was busy with Wyatt. Now, hurry. We bolted down the hallway in the back of the cabin into the small bathroom. Mitch slammed the door. We could still hear Wyatt shrieking in the other room. After a while, it stopped. Then all we could hear was the beast feeding. Mitch locked the door. We could still hear the wolf creature eating Wyatt in the other room, ripping, tearing, chomping, munching. The occasional crunch of snapping bones. Me and Kenny looked frantically around the bathroom. It was small and cramped, barely enough room for 3 people. A toilet, sink, shower, nothing else. There were no windows, no way to escape. We were cornered in here, Abruptly, silence descended on the other side of the door. Mitch pressed his ear against the door, listening intently. I started to say something to him. I don't remember what, but he shushed me and waved for silence. He turned to us, scared. I had never seen Mitch look scared in all the time I had known him. "It's coming this way," he whispered. "Oh shit," I whispered. I listened and could faintly hear floorboards slowly creaking. The sound was approaching the bathroom door. Suddenly, something heavy thudded against the door from the other side, causing us all to jump. Kenny screamed. The door shuddered as the thing on the other side suddenly banged against it, snarling and slobbering. Took out his 9mm and snapped the safety off. Calmly, he aimed at the door. When the beast hit it again, Mitch fired, emptying his entire magazine. The gunshots were deafening. 16 small, splintery holes appeared in the surface of the door. After my ears stopped ringing, I listened, but heard nothing but our own terrified breathing. An eternity seemed to pass. I looked hopefully at Mitch, beginning to think it was over. There came a monstrous, ungodly roar of rage from outside the bathroom, so loud it made the gunshots that came before seem like the popping of a kid's cap gun in comparison. It slammed into the bathroom door with what felt like the force of a freight train. The entire cabin seemed to tremble from the impact. We recoiled in terror. The creature slammed into the door again, full force, and a vertical crack appeared right down the middle. The third blow and the splintering door stoved in a little. "Fuck," Mitch shouted and threw himself against the door, bracing his body against it. He looked at me in wild-eyed desperation. "Help me," he yelled. I joined him, putting my own weight against the failing door to reinforce it. The monstrous wolf thing hit it a fourth time, and my entire body seemed to vibrate with the concussion. I could feel the door give a little more. The creature's strength was unimaginable. I envisioned a pair of ants futilely attempting to hold up a crumbling dam against the immense weight of a flooded river threatening to burst through and engulf them. Kenny was no help at all. While this was going on, he had curled up in the bathtub and was going batshit hysterical. Another huge blow from the other side. One or two more and the door would give out. I closed my eyes and clenched my teeth in anticipation, knowing I was about to die, but the next blow never came. I opened my eyes and looked at Mitch. He looked back. We listened. Silence. We waited, expecting some new tactic or trick, but the beast had stopped attacking the door. Suddenly there was another sound, but from further away, outside maybe. The distant sound of crashing metal and shattering glass. Then nothing. But we waited for several more minutes to be safe. Then Mitch motioned me back. He unlocked the half-demolished bathroom door and cracked it open an inch. He peered out, then nodded to me and opened it the rest of the way. Stepped out of the bathroom, Kenny trailing behind us. We cautiously entered the main room, looking around for any sign of trouble, but the beast seemed to be gone. To Wyatt's body, or rather, what was left of it, not much, was scattered across the bloody floor. The door to the cabin was standing wide open. "I think it left," I said. What the fuck was that thing? Kenny said in a shaky voice. I think we all know what it was, Mitch replied flatly. And he was right, but none of us could bring ourselves to utter the word we were all thinking. Well, let's get the fuck out of here before it comes back, I said. We hurried outside and started in the direction of Mitch's car, but stopped in our tracks, staring. Shit, Mitch whispered. The metallic crashing sound we'd heard from the bathroom had been the beast flipping Mitch's Challenger over on its roof. It lay with its shredded tires. They'd been slashed to ribbons in the air, shattered glass scattered around it from the broken windows. Fuck that plan, Mitch muttered. Christ, it must be one strong motherfucker, Kenny commented. What the fuck do we do now? I asked Mitch. We can't walk out of here on foot with that thing running around. We'd be sitting ducks. Maybe it'll leave us alone, Kenny suggested hopefully. Maybe it won't come back. As if to contradict him, at that moment there was another of those unearthly howls from somewhere off in the distance. It was still out there in the woods. Let's get back inside, Mitch said. And we followed him into the cabin. The Mitch slammed the door and looked around. Ken, give me a hand here, he ordered. Together, they worked to stand the couch upright and moved it against the door as a barricade. What about the windows? I asked. We can board them. No, Mitch replied, shaking his head. There isn't enough wood in the cabin to cover them all. Besides, the hammer and nails are in the shed outside. Sooner or later it's going to come back for us, I pointed out. We gotta call the cops, Kenny said, panicking. Mitch. A girl we kidnapped. What about the Russian? I suggested. What the fuck do you expect him to do? He'd think we were fucked up on something or we'd gone nuts. No, we're on our own here, Mitch said. We have to kill it when it comes back. How? Bullets just seem to piss it off. What about silver bullets? Kenny offered. That's just movie bullshit, Mitch said with a dismissive snort. You got a better idea? I challenged him. None of us even know how to make a silver bullet, he retorted. No, just standard hardball. Why? Shit, I muttered, dejected. Same here, I was thinking we could melt down some silver and pour it into some hollow points. I've got hollow points, Kenny spoke up. He took out his .357 and removed the bullets, holding them out for us to see. Okay, now the next question is, do any of us have any silver? Mitch asked. Shook my head instantly and looked expectantly at the other two. No, Kenny muttered, looking down at the floor. Mitch just shrugged and smiled ruefully. Well, it was a good idea, anyway. Wait, I snapped, turning sharply to face Kenny. What about your medal? Come on, Kenny. Hand it over, I said. No way. God damn it. Our fucking lives are on the line. It's from my mom. She gave it to me before she died. Mitch had had enough of Kenny's bullshit. He took out his pistol and pressed it against Kenny's forehead. Kenny froze and all the color drained from his face. Hand over that fucking medal or I'm going to arrange a little family reunion for you, he said in a low, calm, menacing tone. He kissed it. Mitch examined it. Maybe enough for 6, he guessed. There was another roar from outside. It sounded closer. Me and Kenny rummaged through the drawers and cabinets. Finally, I found a small propane torch under the sink. Mitch placed Kenny's St. Christopher's medal in a small saucepan. He lit the nozzle of the torch with his Zippo and turned its flame upon the metal. We watched, our hearts racing as slowly the metal softened, then melted into liquid silver. Mitch carefully poured a few drops into each of the hollow cavities in the tips of each .357 slug until they were full. We waited a few minutes for the silver to cool and harden. Then Mitch reloaded Kenny's .357 with the silver-tipped bullets. We were ready. Okay, Mitch said, now we wait. There was another roar from the woods outside, much closer than the first 2. It was coming for us. Get behind me, Mitch commanded me and Kenny. We did as we were told. So we huddled together in the center of the room. Mitch raised the .357 Magnum, pointing it at the barricaded door. I hope this works, he said. There was another roar, so loud it seemed to pierce my eardrums. It sounded like it was right outside the cabin. Then something clawed at the door. Then there was a pounding. The door rattled in its frame, the couch pushed in front of it shaking. A snarl. Mitch tensed. He cocked the revolver. He waited. Shoot it. Kenny hissed at him. There's only 6 rounds, we can't waste any. We have to be sure, he answered. The couch scooted back a couple inches as the wolf thing started shoving the door open. My heart felt like it was going to burst through my ribcage. I couldn't breathe. This was it. But then the thing retreated back from the door. We could hear it stomping around outside, circling the cabin. We turned in a circle to follow it, Mitch keeping the gun aimed in front of him. What the fuck is it doing? I whispered to him. It must know something's up, he whispered back. I could hear its feet or paws or whatever the fuck they were, crunching through the dead leaves on the ground outside. It circled the cabin 2 or 3 times, then there was only silence. It's toying with us, hunting us, Mitch said grimly, trying to wait us out. Just then the lights began to flutter. Oh, what the fuck is this shit? Kenny shouted, alarmed. Shit, it's the generator. Forgot all about it. Must be almost out of gas, Mitch said. Great, I muttered. I stood there in the dark, scared shitless and trying to make sense of the insane nightmare I had suddenly found myself inexplicably thrown into. "Kenny," I said, turning to him, "did that girl say or do anything strange? Was she acting weird before Wyatt attacked her?" "Yeah, she started freaking out right after you guys left. She kept telling me and Wyatt to let her go or something bad was going to happen. She said she needed to take her medication before midnight." "Medication?" I asked, confused. "She said it was in her purse. She had to take it every night before bed. It helped suppress the symptoms of her condition, whatever the fuck that meant. She said something about how she had to get back home so her dad could take her to the facility tonight because it was time for her annual treatment." "Then what happened?" I asked him. "Wyatt got fed up listening to her. He told her to shut the fuck up. She just kept going on and on, getting hysterical. He told me to gag her. I lifted the pillowcase to put a dish rag in her mouth, but she bit me. Then she got up and tried to run for it. That's when Wyatt went ape shit. I felt suddenly very cold." "Wait, she bit you?" "Yeah. Look," he lit his lighter and held up his hand for me to see. For the first time I noticed there was a fresh band-aid on his index finger that hadn't been there when me and Mitch had left to get food in town. It doesn't hurt too bad. Barely even broke the skin. "Mitch," I called. He come over. What is it?" "Kenny was bitten. The girl bit him while we in town. He might be infected." "Hey," Kenny snapped defensively, "what the fuck are you getting at? In the movies, when someone gets bitten or scratched by one of them, they turn into one of them." I said, "That's just the fucking movies. You don't know that for sure." He began to back away from us, scared. "And we don't know that you won't," Mitch said, looking at Kenny warily. "That was hours ago. Don't you think if it was going to happen, it already would have?" He argued desperately. "Maybe it just takes a while for the infection to spread," Mitch countered. "Fuck you, Mitch. Look at this, both of you." He stepped back in front of one of the windows, standing in the moonlight streaming in through the glass behind him. He pointed anxiously at his own face. "Look, it's the full moon outside. Look at my face. No fur, no fangs, no yellow eyes. It's just me, Kenny. It's just me. It's just..." With a roar, the beast smashed through the glass behind him and seized Kenny around the waist. It snatched him outside so quickly he didn't even have time to yell in surprise. Kenny began to scream wildly outside. We could hear him struggling. "Let me go. Get away from me. Let me go." Ah, his voice was growing fainter. It was carrying him away deeper into the woods. "No." We waited. An hour passed. Then 2. I glanced at my phone. It was nearly 3 in the morning. Mitch and I sat back to back in the middle of the room so we could keep watch on all 4 sides. We hadn't heard the creature since it had taken Kenny. We waited. We were tired and cold. Cold air was pouring in through the shattered window. And scared, but we waited. Another hour passed. Nothing happened. "Maybe it's not coming," I said to Mitch. So we waited, and eventually it came. Its grand entrance was rather spectacular, but its demise was pretty anticlimactic, all things considered. There was a roar, then the creature burst through the wall, snarling and howling, and Mitch fired 3 carefully aimed silver-tipped slugs into its chest. It howled in pain and collapsed to the floor, spasming. It didn't transform back into the teenaged girl before it died. She didn't look at us with gratitude now that the curse was finally broken and whisper thank you before closing her eyes and dying with an expression of peace after a lifetime of torment. No, there was none of that cliched Hollywood bullshit. Instead, it melted. Before our eyes, in a matter of seconds, the beast melted, its fur and skin liquefying, until there was only an inhuman, misshapen skeleton lying in a puddle of rancid-smelling, translucent green slime. We stood there breathing heavily, unable to believe it had ended so abruptly, that the nightmare was over. Mitch went to the broken window and looked out at the moonlit woods, releasing a long sigh as his tension eased. "Okay," he said, turning to me, "let's get the fuck outta." A second wolf beast appeared in the window. It was larger than the female and badly maimed. One of its arms chewed away at the shoulder, large bleeding wounds covering its body, one of its yellow eyes missing. Kenny, or what had been Kenny. It leaped into the cabin, landing on all fours, then standing fully erect on its hind legs. Mitch was caught off guard. He raised a revolver, but was a second too late. The wolf creature swiped its taloned claw down his chest, leaving deep, hideous gashes in his flesh. Then it seized Mitch and sank its jaws into his throat, shaking its head back and forth, savaging him viciously. Mitch screamed. He dropped the .357, and it skidded across the floor, stopping right at my feet. I grabbed the revolver, aimed, and fired once into the monster's shoulder. It roared in pain and released Mitch, who dropped like a sack of potatoes. It spun around to face me, a primal look of rage on its face. I fired again, hitting the beast right between the eyes. Blood and brains exploded out the back of its head. It slumped to the floor, died, and melted into a heap of bones and slime. I lowered the gun, then ran to Mitch's side. I could see right away his injuries were mortal. His chest wound was bleeding profusely, and the left side of his throat was shredded and steadily pumping blood. "Fuck," he gasped as I knelt beside him. He got me good. "Don't think about it," I told him, pressing my handkerchief against his throat while trying to get him to his feet. "I'll take you to a hospital. You'll be fine." "Fuck that. I'm done." "We both know it. Don't talk like that, man. You're talking shit. You know what you gotta do. There's one bullet left. You gotta waste me." "No fucking way, man." "Man, you have to. I'm infected. When I die, I'll turn, like Kenny. I can't, man. You're my fucking homeboy." I felt the sting of tears in my eyes. "No, I'm not," Mitch said coldly and looked at me darkly. "I was supposed to kill you." "I was supposed to shoot you. After the guy paid, all 3 of you, the Russian, arranged it. It was the plan, right from the start. Make it look like you killed the girl, then shot each other in an argument. After you buried her, there's another car parked down a path, a mile behind the cabin. Plant your prints. Give the cops a neat little package. There was never going to be any payout, though 10 mil. I would get paid 5 mil after." He looked at me intently, and I would have done it too. I looked closely into his eyes and saw he was telling the truth. I had never felt such a sense of betrayal. "You son of a bitch," I whispered. I stood up, aimed the revolver at his head. and pulled the trigger. After the sun had risen, I went outside. I found a path behind the cabin and followed it till it led to a small lake about a mile away. I looked, but there was no second car. I understood. I closed my eyes. "Oh God, Mitch," I groaned. There was a 55-gallon fuel drum behind the cabin to supply the generator. I looked in the shed and found an old gas can. I filled it from the drum, then poured gasoline throughout the cabin. I looked through Mitch's pockets and found his Zippo. There was an inscription on it I had never noticed before. "To the world's greatest dad love, Chloe." I went to the doorway, flipped back the lid on the Zippo, struck it alight, and tossed it inside. The gasoline ignited with a whoosh, and the flames spread rapidly across the floor. I took out my .45, wiped it clean of prints, and threw it into the cabin. I walked some distance away to watch the blaze spread. When I was satisfied that the cabin was properly aflame, I walked down the dirt road back into town. There was a bus depot on Main Street. I used cash to purchase a ticket and took a Greyhound south. I wound up in Florida. I found a job working as a bartender at a resort hotel. The pay ain't great, but it ain't bad either, and I get by. I never got the 10 mil I was promised and never saw the Russian again. I don't mind. That thing that happened last fall was a wake-up call for me. I had a moment of clarity, I guess you could say, and stepped away from a life of crime. Frankly, I'm just grateful I made it out of that mess alive. I still miss Mitch, though. There's just one thing that keeps me up at night. One thing I dwell on when I'm trying to get to sleep, especially on nights when the moon is full. I think about what Kenny told me the girl told him. She said her affliction was a condition, not a gypsy curse or any of that crap. A condition. Maybe something genetic, something she was just born with. Could there be others like her out there? Wouldn't surprise me a bit. There are dark, unnatural things hiding in the corners of the world, and not all of the monsters we were scared of as kids are made up. Some of them are real, and some might be lurking closer than you think.